Now I'd like to talk about application of the characteristics I've just talked about to the study area that you're working on in lab. And I want to talk about that in two parts. The first part is talking about mapping characteristics that are contributing to water quality contamination in the landscape. And the second part is how do we put those maps together to come up with overall indices of water quality contamination susceptibility. The first thing we typically need to do in a mapping regime is to identify the hydrologic structure of the study area that we're working in. And this involves dividing the landscape into sub-watersheds, and on the right-hand side you see these black lines, and these black lines generally encircle a green area. The green area is a bottomland area, and so everything inside of the black line is creating drainage that is flowing into the green bottomland area. And then, as I said, the red areas represent unbuffered conditions in between the upland area and the bottomland area, and the blue represents buffered conditions. So the first thing we need to do is to identify the hydrologic structure of the landscape in terms of its subbasins and the upland and bottomland conditions and buffer conditions within each of those hydrologic units. Then we need to begin to look at the sources of contaminants in the landscape. And here we see a map called Soil Contaminant Sources within the Lake Town Township study area. These are soils that are highly erodible and they have low infiltration capacity. So as having low infiltration capacity, that means more runoff is going to move across the soil, and the soil is highly erodible. So as more runoff is moving across a highly erodible soil, we're going to see a lot of contaminants, soil particle contaminants, moving out of the upland areas and being deposited in the bottomland areas. So we're going to see a lot of soil contaminants moving out of the upland area, flowing into the bottomland area. And whether it actually makes it entirely there depends upon what's happening in the buffer zone. In the blue buffer zones, the buffer vegetation helps to remove contaminants that are coming out of the upland areas and being deposited in bottomland areas. Where there is no vegetative buffer, there's no last-minute possibility of removing upland contaminants before they are discharged into bottomland sinks. Here we can talk about disturbed vegetative cover. This is a polite term for agricultural landscapes. Agricultural landscapes can become sources of surface runoff generation because in cropped areas, cornfields, soybean fields, etc., they spend a significant amount of the year in bare soil conditions. In other words, the soil is in many instances not protected from precipitation and from runoff. So where we have a lot of cropland represented here as disturbed vegetative cover, we're going to be generating, we're going to have the potential to generate a high number of contaminant sources in upland areas for transport to bottomland sinks. Here we see soils that are especially vulnerable to particle detachment and runoff generation. So these also are areas that contribute to movement of contaminants from upland source areas to bottomland sinks. Another source of contamination are urban areas, developed landscapes. Their condition is that they typically have impervious surfaces, and because of their high amount of impervious surface, more of the precipitation regime joins runoff stream, and less of it is able to infiltrate into the adjacent landscape. So we can talk about urban land cover conditions as generating high runoff from the impermeable surfaces. We can combine the potential agricultural source contaminants with the potential urban source contaminants and talk about total contamination sources. This is a composite upland contamination source areas. So the purple that you see on this map represents the areas that I have been referring to as upland source areas. These are areas where contaminants are likely to be generated in upland areas.